Last time at Nine Rings Woodcraft.
So today we are going to be designing a toy box for a friend of mine.
Now it's time to bring the computer design to life. And like always, that starts with picking up some wood and carrying it inside. I'm building this children's toy box out of very expensive hard maple. Just kidding. I'm making it with 1x4 pine because kids are going to destroy it no matter what kind of wood I use, so I'm using cheap wood. I will say, I didn't get this lumber from the big box stores. I still bought it from my local hardwood supplier, and the quality of the wood is noticeably better than Big Orange or Big Blue. The next step is cutting the boards down to rough length and then milling them. Because these boards are S4S, or surfaced on 4 sides, and I made sure to pick flat ones, I didn't need to face joint and plane them. I did edge joint all of them, however, making sure to mark which edge is the 90 degree. It's really easy to get boards turned around and lose track. Then I trimmed all the pieces down to width on the table saw and labeled them. Panels first. There are 5 total: front, back, side, and top. I spent some time laying out the boards so the best looking ones are in the front panel and the gnarliest ones are at the back. Then it's a pretty straightforward glue up. One of the things I love about working at my makerspace,
besides everything,
is the access to these parallel clamps, which I haven't invested in for myself yet. I let the glue dry overnight and then scraped it clean. I started with a chisel until someone pointed out that we have a real glue scraper. And my goodness, what a difference having the right tool makes. With the glue scraped off, I ran the panels through the 25-inch planer just to clean up the faces. This tool is worth the membership to Lowell Makes all by itself. And then trim them down to size on the big crosscut sled. Before building the box, I needed to cut the finger-saving grooves in the front and side boards. No smashing tiny phalanges under the lid on my watch, kids. I traced these out using the leg boards as sizing templates and cut them out on the bandsaw. Stay to the outside of your line when you do this. You'll sand it down to the line later. Ideally, I would have used the oscillating sander to sand these clean, but it was out of commission, so I used a belt sander and then cleaned up the corners with the rounded file and some hand sanding. Kinda tiring and slow, but it got the job done. Rounding over all the exposed edges and giving it a good sanding now will save a lot of trouble later on. And now finally, it's time to actually build the box. But before we do, if you've listened to me this far, consider hitting that like and subscribe button. Okay, I can hear the complaints about the domino already. Relax. It's not mine, it belongs to the makerspace, and this is my first time using it on an actual project. And honestly, I used a 25-inch planer a minute ago that's way less accessible to hobbyists than the domino, and I doubt you got all up in arms about that. Join your local makerspace to use all kinds of tools that you can't afford or can't fit in your shop. Once I reread the domino manual and got everything set up, it was a breeze to use. The alignment tools make everything so simple. No need to measure at all. I can see why people spend a lot of money on one of these. If you don't have access to one, that's fine. Use dowels or screws, or honestly just glue by itself. Parallel clamps kept everything locked in place while it dried. Band clamps would have been better. The box was a good amount out of square when I clamped it, so I had to do some finagling, but I'd already turned the camera off by the time I realized it. I also should have put blue tape on the inside corners. The glue stained the wood even though I cleaned it up, and you can still see it after I applied the finish. I'd say lesson learned here, but I have learned this lesson several times and keep forgetting on the next project. The next step was to build the floor. I ripped 2 boards down to about 32 inches long and half an inch thick, and glued and brad nailed them into the interior bottom of the box. These are the shelves that the floorboards actually rest on. Then I cut the floorboards down to length and fit them into place. Through absolute dumb luck, no planning whatsoever, the boards fit perfectly. I didn't have to trim the width of any of them. More glue and brad nails, and the floor was done. Now for the legs. I first trimmed them down to size, about 1/4 of an inch longer than the box is tall, so the whole unit sits just off the ground. Then I grouped the legs into pairs based on which ones I wanted in the front and back. Picking these now is important because I needed to know which edges to round over at the router table and which to keep square. The front board of the pairs needs the 2 front corners rounded, while the other board only needs the back corner rounded. This is another place where labeling really helps out, as does marking all of the round over corners in advance. I flipped the box upside down and laid it on the concrete floor of the shop, which is the largest flat surface we have. I didn't quite trust the workbenches not to dip a little bit. Then I attached each board to the corners of the box with some glue and brad nails. If I were to do this again, I would cut spacers to sit the box on to get a uniform gap at the base, and then just use a router to trim the top of the legs flush with the top of the box. This way worked, but I think there's a little too much room for error. With the box itself done, I turned my attention to the top. This was pretty simple. I cut a pair of matching braces out of some of the leftover boards and glued them to the top to minimize warping in the future as it gets... Is it still called manhandled when it's little girls smashing it? Then I trimmed the top down to size on the table saw, making sure to leave about 1/2 inch reveal all the way around. I honestly would have liked a slightly bigger overhang, but I didn't leave myself quite enough board for that. Initially fitting the hardware is one of my least favorite parts of any project, particularly hinges. They're so easy to misalign. But I must be getting better because this went off without a hitch. Just some careful measuring and even more careful transfers of those measurements. As is my habit, I only installed these using half the screws. I saved the last screws for the final installation. This way, at least some of them are driving into untouched wood rather than clinging valiantly to an existing screw hole. It just feels more stable that way to me. At home, I filled all the holes with wood putty, and boy, were there a lot of holes, and took the sander to the whole thing a few more times. I also installed the soft close pistons that I found on Amazon. I wound up having to move them once, but not a big deal because the holes were mostly hidden and I just filled them in with wood putty.
Nailed it!
This is my first time using Osmo wood wax finish, so I was extra careful to prep and clean all the surfaces. I wiped it down, blew it off, wiped it down with a tack cloth, and then blew it off again. The Osmo was simple to apply, but I wouldn't say easy. I went with the double rag Mr. Miyagi wipe on, wipe off method, and by the end of all that surface area, my arms were starting to burn pretty good. Next time, I'll probably try a different application method, maybe a brush. But tiring as it was, that first coat turned out great, and the second coat turned out even better. I can see why people love this stuff. As I was finishing, I also realized that while not heavy, the box is pretty hard to move around solo. It really needs handles. So I went out to the hardware store and grabbed some nice black handles and installed them. Anyone see my mistake? There you go. That's better. Then I installed the hinges and pistons, using all the screws this time to secure it. Of course, I tested it out a few times with some of my kids' toys. These stuffies seemed happy enough, and my kids were mad that I'd made one for their friends and not for them, so all in all, it seemed like the build was a success. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. If you like this kind of build project, consider liking and subscribing so you don't miss an upload.